Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for watching. Tonight, we're going to be answering a question that many people have been asking, and that is, do violent video games actually cause violent behaviour? Now, aside from the fact that there are millions and millions of gamers who have not gone on killing sprees, there's a lot of evidence that can go both ways.
As you can see here, many video games are violent, yes. But the statement that violent video games negatively affect the behaviour of people makes literally as much sense as saying that people who play SimCity are bound to become urban planners. But seeing as how I actually need to prove my point with statistics and not just common sense, I've decided to do some research. I do know of someone who might be of help in my quest. A teacher of mine, Mr. Preston Pickus.
Hello, Mr. Pickus, and thanks for having me here. Got a few questions for you, which I've got here on my laptop. And first off, do you have any initial thoughts on this whole thing, on the whole concept of video games actually causing violence?
Initial thoughts. I don't have many initial thoughts. I like video games. I saw a TED Talk about the power of video games to increase a person's capacity for spatial reasoning, but I'd like to know more about what we're going to be talking about in terms of video games and violence.
Okay. Do you think that you're particularly knowledgeable in this field?
Yes. As an avid video game player in my youth, and a teacher who supervises students that love and play video games, and as a consumer of mass media, in addition to my own research, I would say I'm relatively knowledgeable. I give myself.
Okay. So the main question is, do you think that video games actually cause violence?
No. So I guess the question would be qualitative. To what degree do video games encourage violence, right? So, I mean, I'd say that there's a small chance that it promotes violence, and so in that way perhaps encourages it, but I think it's overblown. I don't think that there's a causal relationship between playing a violent video game and going and performing violence. I would say that most of those instances you would see some sort of mental health deterioration or sort of misappropriation of logic, but and then that fantasy could be lived out from the video game, but I don't think directly violent video games cause violence.
So, do you have any opinions on critics arguing either way?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of times they're looking for a scapegoat.
Yes.
Sometimes when somebody does violence, it's incomprehensible, and it would be nice to have a tangible thing, a simple solution, and so sometimes that simple solution could be no more violent video games, no more violence on TV, when the problem is actually quite a bit more complex. The United States has a health care issue. We don't treat mentally unhealthy people very well, and we don't have a lot of resources for a person to access if they're mentally unwell. But that's a very hard thing to change. That's a large bureaucracy, so it's much easier to say, oh, it's violent video games, so it's violent movies, and then try to stop that, rather than dealing with the real issue, which could be really difficult and complex.
Okay, that's good. So I checked out the summary of your book, The Television Addict, and do you think this has any bearing on the subject, as in the media influencing behavior?
Well, my book, The Television Addict, is about a guy who's physically addicted to television. He can't be without the stimulation of the media. So it's not as much about the violence on TV as it is about violence in his life. So he's escaping his own feelings of anguish by living in the fantasy world of television. So it would actually be a backwards effect of that. It would be violence causing a retreat into fantasy, rather than, I'd say, what the argument, people who argue that video games cause violence are saying that the fantasy is transferred into reality.
Okay, it's also human nature to pin blame on someone or something after a tragedy, so do you think this whole thing is just seeing connections where there aren't any?
Yes, I'd say, I'm hesitant to say that there is no connection between violence in media and violence in real life. I would say that there are some requisite capacities that have to exist first. For instance, in our study of psychopaths, we know that there's a genetic inclination in the brain that can help that primes a person to be a psychopath, but that if they don't experience some sort of violent occurrence, they don't become a psychopath. They remain a normal person. In the same way, I think that there are people who are primed for violence by whatever circumstances, being ignored or maybe not having friends or having unhealthy relationships or not very much parental oversight, they're primed for violence, and then perhaps the video game is an element of that. So I wouldn't say that they're not exactly grasping at straws. I'd just say it's not a fundamental element that's responsible for violence.
So people used to, and actually still, blame television, rock and roll, things like that throughout time for precisely the same things. So is it just history repeating itself?
Yeah, probably, right? When rock and roll came out, it was going to ruin the world because it wasn't classical music, and I'm sure there were elements of, or jazz, and jazz wasn't classical, and so on and so forth. Every generation gets old and then hates the things that the kids do. So I'd say that this is an element of this. People in their 50s and 60s who didn't grow up with video games saying, "Oh, video games are the problem." That seems like a reasonable conclusion to come to.
And that is our conclusion, because that was the last question I had to ask. So
Great.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you,
Thank
Sammy.
you for having me.
All right. Great.
Okay, have a nice day.
Okay. Good. Is that it?
Yep, that's everything.
Great. Good job, Sammy. That was good. One thing I'll call.
This video is unfinished. Expect the full version on my channel soon.
Spooky, scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. Shrieking skulls will shock your soul, seal your doom tonight.